My family laughed when I salvaged my grandpa's things from the trash where they threw them, calling it junk. I've always been the Plan B kid in my family. My name's Jack, 24 years old now, but this story takes me back to when I was barely out of high school, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with my life, while everyone else seemed to have their lives together. You know how some families have that golden child who can do no wrong? That was my sister Kate. Honor roll, captain of the cheerleading squad, homecoming queen, the whole suburban American dream package. She was like something straight out of a 90s Coca-Cola commercial, all perfect teeth and perfect future. Mom and Dad basically had her college graduation photos framed before she even finished sophomore year. Then there was me, the guy who spent weekends fixing up old cars, who lived in a cramped apartment above Mr. Guzman's convenience store, and who blasted Nirvana and Pearl Jam on a cassette player I rescued from a yard sale. I was a kid who sketched during math class and came home with grease-stained jeans more often than report cards. Jack, were you going to grow up and get serious about your future? Mom would ask whenever I'd show her my latest drawing. She didn't say it with malice, just genuine confusion, like she couldn't understand where this strange, artsy kid had come from in their practical, achievement-oriented family. Dad was more direct. Art doesn't pay bills, son. Kate's already got scholarships lined up. What's your plan? My plan? I didn't have one, and that scared the heck out of them. In our family photo albums, Kate's pages were filled with trophies, certificates, and pictures with the mayor. My pages were, well, let's just say considerably thinner. The classic American family narrative. One kid headed for success, one headed for something else. But there was one person who never made me feel like a backup plan. My grandfather, Frank. Grandpa Frank was a relic from another time. He wore sweaters with holes in the elbows, not because he couldn't afford new ones, but because he claimed they had character. He drank tea with raspberry jam instead of sugar, a habit from his Navy days, and painted canvases nobody in our family understood or appreciated. "Everything has a soul, Jack," he'd tell me while we sat in his cluttered living room, even this old lamp. He'd point to the ugly brass monstrosity that had probably been outdated since the Ford administration. It's seen conversations, arguments, love stories. It's absorbed the energy of this house for decades. I'd laugh, but deep down I believed him. That was the thing about Grandpa Frank. He made the weird seem normal and the normal seem boring as hell. His house smelled like oil paints, dusty books, and freedom. No judgment, no comparisons to Kate, no veiled disappointment. Just two misfits hanging out. We'd spend hours in his makeshift studio, actually just a converted garage, but he called it the atelier with an exaggerated French accent that made me crack up. Johnny Cash playing on his ancient record player, paint smudges on everything, and conversations that meander like a country road. Art isn't about what you see, Jack. It's about what you feel, he'd say, mixing colors with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, even when the result looked like a psychedelic hurricane. The greatest mistake people make is thinking art has to be pretty. It doesn't. It has to be true. Those words hit me harder than any motivational poster at school ever did. My dad called Grandpa Frank the old eccentric when he was being nice, and that stubborn old coot when he wasn't. Dad had taken the safe route in life, accounting for 01k, suburban home with a lawn he obsessively mowed every Saturday. To him, Grandpa's artistic lifestyle was irresponsible at best, a cautionary tale at worst. You'd be better off studying or learning a trade instead of messing around with that junk. Dad would say whenever I mentioned spending time at Grandpa's. Once, I overheard him whispering to Mom in the kitchen, "Jack and Frank are two peas in a pod, both hopelessly impractical." The way he said hopelessly stung more than I let on. But what Dad called impractical, I called real. While my classmates stress about college applications and internships at their parents' friends' companies, I was learning how to mix the perfect shade of sunset orange or how to make charcoal lines speak without words. Grandpa Frank had been an accountant too. Actually, something my father conveniently forgot to mention when making his arguments against my artistic inclinations. He'd worked for some big corporation for 30 years, wearing suits and crunching numbers. "Worst 3 decades of my life," he told me once. but it put your dad through college and kept a roof over our heads. The minute I retired, I bought paints and never looked back. That's why his garage was packed with canvases. He was making up for lost time. Some were landscapes, others abstract explosions of color, and some were portraits of people I'd never know. All of them together told the story of a man who'd waited too long to become himself. "Don't make my mistake, Jack," he said on my 20th birthday, handing me a set of professional-grade brushes that probably cost more than he should have spent. "Don't wait until you're old to be who you are." I kept those brushes in a special case, even though I couldn't really afford canvas to use them on. They represented something more important than art supplies. They were permission to be myself in a family where I'd always felt like the odd one out. Every other Sunday, I'd drive my beat-up 1987 Honda Civic to Grandpa's place. The car barely made it up the hills with its struggling transmission, but somehow it always got me there. Those Sundays were sacred. No family dinners, no overtime at the auto shop where I worked part-time. Nothing could interfere. Grandpa would have coffee ready, though he called it brown sludge and refused to drink it himself, and we'd settle into our routine. Sometimes we painted side by side. Other times I'd just watch him work, absorbing his techniques and philosophies in equal measure. "Most people are afraid of making mistakes," he said once, deliberately smearing what looked like a perfectly good mountain landscape. "But mistakes are just detours to something better than what you planned." I thought those Sundays were just about painting, about escaping my cramped apartment and the weight of being the family disappointment, about learning from someone who saw value in the things I loved. I didn't know those evenings were actually about something much bigger, that those hours spent with oil paints and classic country music were actually the key to something that would change everything. Looking back, I should have noticed how he sometimes stared at certain paintings with an intensity that went beyond artistic pride. How he kept that one old landscape, the one Grandma had bought at a garage sale for $5 before she passed, hanging in a special spot despite its faded colors and unremarkable scene. But I was too wrapped up in my own stuff, working extra shifts to make rent, dodging my dad's career advice, trying to figure out if Rachel from the coffee shop was flirting or just being nice when she drew smiley faces on my cup. Then came that Tuesday in April when everything changed. I called Grandpa Frank like I always did midweek, just to check in and maybe talk about the new art supply store that opened downtown. The phone rang and rang. No answer. Not too weird. He sometimes forgot to charge his ancient flip phone. I tried again an hour later. Still nothing. Something felt off. Grandpa always answered my calls, even if he was in the middle of painting. He joked that his artistic flow could survive a brief interruption from his favorite grandson. I was his only grandson, but the joke still made me feel special. I left work early, telling my boss I had a family emergency. The entire drive to Grandpa's house, I kept convincing myself I was overreacting. He was probably just napping or had gone out for supplies. Maybe he'd finally agreed to that lunch with Miss Peterson from across the street, who'd been bringing him homemade banana bread for months in what had to be the world's most obvious courtship attempt. But when I pulled in his driveway and saw his car still there, the curtains drawn despite the beautiful spring day, my heart sank to my stomach. What I found inside his house broke me in ways I didn't know I could break. But that's not where the story ends. It's where it truly begins. I found Grandpa Frank in his favorite armchair, looking peaceful with his eyes closed. The paramedic said it was quick, a heart attack while he slept. He must have dozed off during his evening painting session, something he did often. His paintbrush had fallen onto the side table, and a half-finished landscape sat on the easel nearby, showing a sunrise over mountains I'd never seen but somehow recognized. At least he went doing what he loved. I whispered to nobody in particular. The funeral was straight out of a bad cable movie. Cheap plastic flowers arranged in symmetrical bouquets. A minister who kept calling him Francis instead of Frank. A reception with store-bought cookies and coffee that my great-aunt Meredith loudly complained was too cold. The whole production felt wrong for a man who'd spent his life creating beauty. Mom cried quietly. Dad stood stoic, handling paperwork and thanking people for coming with the efficiency of someone completing a particularly unpleasant chore. Kate flew in from college, looking genuinely sad but checking her watch throughout the service. I stood off to the side, clutching Grandpa's old paintbrush in my pocket. He'd given it to me the month before, saying it had good energy and that I should use it when I was ready to paint something that matters. I hadn't used it yet. Now I wondered if I ever would. We should get the house cleared out by next weekend. Dad announced at the reception, between handshakes with distant relatives I barely recognized. The realtor says it'll sell quickly in this market. Just like that. 78 years of life reduced to a real estate opportunity. After everyone left, I stayed behind at the funeral home, staring at the closed casket. The director eventually came over, jingling his keys in that universal signal that meant time to go. He taught me everything important, I told the man, who nodded with professional sympathy. Not how to make money or get ahead, how to see the world differently. Sounds like a special man, the director replied, ushering me gently toward the door. He was, I said, and no one even looked at his paintings today. I spent the next few days in a fog, going through the motions at work, avoiding my apartment because the silence felt too much like grief. I hadn't cried yet. It felt stuck somewhere behind my ribs, a pressure that wouldn't release. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from Dad. Need to clear out the house. Can you help Saturday? And what should we do with all that painting stuff? And finally, if you don't respond, we're just going to handle it. I didn't respond. I couldn't bear the thought of them, handling Grandpa's life like it was just another task to check off. Saturday morning came too quickly. I overslept, having finally crashed after 3 nights of insomnia. By the time I pulled into Grandpa's driveway, there was already a small dumpster in front of the garage, and Dad's SUV parked beside it. As I walked up the cracked concrete path to the front door, I heard voices from the backyard. I followed the sound, rounding the corner of the house to a scene that stopped me cold. Dad and our neighbor, Mr. Peterson, were heaving canvases into the dumpster. Dozens of Grandpa's paintings, landscapes, abstracts, portraits, were being tossed like trash, landing with hollow thunks against a metal container. Something snapped inside me. All the grief and anger I'd been suppressing erupted at once. What the hell are you doing? I shouted, running toward them. Dad turned, holding another canvas, the one of the old lighthouse that Grandpa had painted after his last road trip to Maine. Oh, Jack finally decided to show up. His tone was casual, like he was commenting on the weather instead of destroying someone's life's work. Put that down, I said, my voice shaking. We got to clear everything out, he replied, tossing the painting into the dumpster. The realtor is coming Monday. Those are his paintings. I grabbed the next one from Mr. Peterson's hands. That's his legacy. Dad sighed, wiping sweat from his forehead. Jack, it's junk. Nobody wants these. They're just taking up space. I want them, I said, my chest tight. What for? Where would you even put them? In that closet you call an apartment. He reached for another canvas. Be realistic for once. Mr. Peterson looked uncomfortable, shuffling his feet and muttering something about checking on his sprinkler system. He disappeared around the corner, leaving me and Dad alone with the dumpster between us. Did you even look at them? I asked, picking up a small portrait from the pile they hadn't thrown away yet. It was a mom, young and laughing, before life and responsibility had made her serious. Did you see what he created? I saw a bunch of amateur paintings nobody's going to buy, Dad replied. Look, I know you two had your art thing, but it's time to be practical. What are we supposed to do with 55 paintings? Don't throw away his work like it meant nothing. My voice cracked, and I felt tears finally breaking through. This was his life. Dad scoffed. Life? This is hobby stuff, Jack. Just like your drawings. It's not a life. It's a distraction from real responsibilities. That hit exactly where he intended it to. The eternal disappointment. Like father, like son, both wasting time on art instead of real pursuits. We argued until we were shouting, me defending Grandpa's art and by extension, my own choices. Dad dismissing both as impractical fantasies. It ended when he said something that cut deeper than anything else. This garbage is just like your art dreams, worthless in the real world. I lunged at him then, not to hit him, but to stop him from throwing another painting away. Mr. Peterson, who apparently hadn't gone far, rushed back and pulled me away. I stood there, breathing hard, feeling like a stranger in my own family. "Take whatever you want," Dad finally said, throwing his hands up. "The rest goes tomorrow. I've got a house to sell." He walked away, leaving me beside the dumpster half filled with my grandfather's life. I didn't waste any time. While Dad and Mom went inside to sort through Grandpa's personal effects, I began the rescue operation. First, I carefully pulled out every canvas I could reach from the dumpster, laying them on the grass. Some had frame damage from the fall. One had a tear in the corner. I felt sick looking at them, discarded like last week's newspapers. Next, I gathered the paintings still stacked in piles around the yard, the ones waiting their turn for the trash. I arranged everything in groups by size, tried to figure out how to transport them all in my tiny Honda Civic. Dad and Mom left around sunset, offering a half-hearted invitation to dinner that I declined. Once they were gone, I did a thorough sweep of the house, finding even more paintings, stashed in closets, under beds, behind furniture. Some were framed, others just raw canvas. Many had Grandpa's little signature in the corner, FW for Frank Wilson. My car groaned under the weight as I loaded the first batch of paintings into the back seat trunk and finally the passenger seat beside me. The suspension dipped dangerously low, forcing me to drive 5 miles under the speed limit back to my apartment, peering around canvases that blocked most of my view. It took 3 full trips to transport all 55 paintings. By the final run, I was exhausted but determined. As I drove through the quiet streets of our town with the last load, I thought about what Grandpa once told me. "People throw away what they don't understand, Jack. That's why you have to protect what matters, even when nobody else sees its value." At the time, I thought he was talking about art in general. Now I wondered if he'd been preparing me for exactly this moment. By midnight, my tiny apartment looked like a gallery had exploded inside it. Paintings leaned against every wall, stacked 3 deep in some places. I had to climb over landscapes to get to my bathroom and squeeze past portraits to reach my bed. That night, I fell asleep surrounded by his work. The smell of oil paint and the frames were oddly comforting. For the first time since finding him, I slept without nightmares. The next morning, my phone exploded with texts from Dad. "Did you take all the paintings? The realtor needs a house cleared out completely. Jack, what are you planning to do with them?" I didn't answer. Instead, I made coffee and sat cross-legged on my floor, really looking at each painting one by one. Some were from decades ago, the colors slightly faded, the style more traditional. Others were recent, with bold strokes and vivid hues that showed how his confidence had grown over the years. There were scenes from places he'd visited and places I suspected existed only in his imagination. One painting in particular caught my attention, the oldest one in the collection. It wasn't even one of his. It was a faded landscape Grandma had bought at a garage sale for $5 back in the 80s. Grandpa had always kept it in a special place in his studio, saying it had character. Looking at it now, I couldn't see anything special about it. Just an old, somewhat amateurish painting of mountains and a lake, the frame scratched and the backing warped from humidity. Why had he kept this one? Why had it been hanging in the place of honor in his studio when he had so many better works of his own? I set it aside, making a mental note to examine it more closely later. Over the next few days, I arranged the paintings around my apartment, trying to give them the respect they deserved despite my limited space. I called in sick to work twice, unable to leave them. It felt like Grandpa was there with me, in every brushstroke and color choice. My landlord, Mr. Guzman, came up to complain about the noise from all my rearranging. When he saw the apartment, his eyes widened. "Your grandfather's?" he asked, recognizing the style from the one painting I'd had hanging before. I nodded. He walked around slowly, looking at each piece. "This is not junk," he finally said, gesturing to the collection. "This is a legacy." Those words echoed in my head all night. Legacy. Not trash. Not a hobby. A legacy. In my cramped little apartment, surrounded by Grandpa Frank's life's work, I realized these paintings were more than just canvas and paint. They were his voice, his way of seeing the world, and now they were my responsibility. I remembered something else Grandpa told me once. The most valuable things in life aren't what people tell you to value. They're the things that speak to your soul when nobody else is listening. These paintings spoke to me, and I started to wonder if they might have something important to say. Little did I know that among these 55 paintings, one would change everything. And it wasn't even one of the good ones. 3 weeks after rescuing Grandpa's paintings, my apartment resembled what you might call a loser museum. Canvases covered every inch of wall space, with the overflow stacked in precarious towers. I'd eaten nothing but frozen pizza for days, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a magnifying glass like some Walmart version of Sherlock Holmes, studying each painting as if it might speak to me. My boss at the auto shop had left 3 increasingly annoyed voicemails about my extended family emergency absence. My landlord, Mr. Guzman, had gone from sympathetic to concerned about the fire hazard of having an art gallery in a studio apartment. And my dad had finally stopped texting after I sent him a photo of my apartment with the caption, "They found a good home." Each painting told a story. The landscapes from Grandpa's trip to Yellowstone when I was 10. The portrait of the old fisherman he befriended at the lake. The abstract swirl of blues and greens he'd painted the summer mom was going through a tough time, but came out stronger. I knew these stories because I'd been there for many of them. Grandpa would talk while he painted, filling the air with memories and observations that seemed random at the time, but now felt intentional, as if he'd been leaving me a verbal map to his life. Art is memory made visible, he used to say. Even if nobody else sees what you see, it still holds a truth. But one painting kept drawing me back. The old, worn landscape that Grandma had bought at a garage sale for $5 back in the 80s. It wasn't particularly good, just a generic mountain scene with a lake and some trees. The frame was scratched in places, and the whole thing had a yellowish tint from decades of exposure. It wasn't one of Grandpa's works, but he'd kept it displayed in a prominent spot in his studio. Whenever I asked about it, he'd just smile and say, "Your grandmother had an eye for special things." I always thought it was just a sentimental thing. He kept it because Grandma had picked it out before she passed. Now, looking at it in my kitchen under the harsh fluorescent light, I couldn't see anything remotely special about it. On the 4th day of my self-imposed art hermitage, I decided to clean it up, not restore it. I didn't have those skills, but at least wipe down the frame and see if I could get some of the grime off. As I carefully removed it from the wall, I noticed the backing was loose. The cardboard that held the canvas in place was warped, with one corner pulling away from the frame. Normally, I would have just pushed it back, but something made me pause. "Don't be paranoid, Jack," I muttered to myself, but my hands were already working at the edge, gently pulling the backing further away. There was a gap between the canvas and the backing board. Something was tucked inside, a yellowed paper, folded like a letter. My heart started racing as I carefully extracted it, trying not to tear the brittle edges. I unfolded it on my kitchen table, smoothing it flat with trembling hands. The paper was thick, nothing like modern printer paper. The text was faded but legible, and the first words nearly stopped my heart. "In Congress, July 4th, 1776. I knew those words. Every American kid does. But this wasn't a school textbook. This wasn't reproduction from a gift shop. This looked real. The typography, the aging of the paper, the way the ink had faded in certain spots. It all screamed authenticity in a way I couldn't articulate but could definitely feel. I stared at it for what felt like hours, afraid to touch it more than necessary, afraid even to breathe on it. The document continued with those famous words we all learned in elementary school. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. This couldn't possibly be what I thought it was. Could it? I took photos from every angle, careful not to use flash. Then I started Googling. By 3 a.m., surrounded by empty coffee mugs and the blue glow of my laptop, I had fallen down the deepest research rabbit hole of my life. What I found made my hands shake, so badly I had to put the phone down. This could be what historians call a Dunlap broadside, one of the original first printed copies of the Declaration of Independence, produced on the night of July 4th, 1776, by Philadelphia printer John Dunlap. Only about 200 were printed. Most were posted in public places and eventually destroyed by weather or simply discarded once the news spread. Today, fewer than 30 are known to exist in the world. Oh my God, I whispered to the empty apartment. Unbelievable. And this was a massive if this was authentic, it would be worth millions. The last one sold at auction went for over $8 million. But that wasn't even what had me freaking out. It was the history in my hands. A piece of paper that had existed on the actual day America declared independence. A document that had survived nearly 250 years, somehow ending up hidden in a painting at a garage sale that my grandmother had bought for less than the cost of a fast food meal. How and why was it hidden? I carefully refolded the document and placed it in a clean manila envelope, the best I could do for preservation at 3 a.m. Then I sat on my bed, surrounded by Grandpa's paintings, trying to process what had just happened. The strangest part was that I was certain Grandpa had no idea what was hidden in that painting. He wasn't the type to keep secrets, especially not something this significant. If he had known there was a priceless historical document behind that canvas, he would have either turned it into a museum or at least told me about it. No, the painting had come with the hidden treasure already inside. Grandma had unknowingly bought a multi-million-dollar historical document for $5 at a garage sale, and neither of them had ever discovered what they really had. Sleep was impossible. I spent the rest of the night combing through memories, trying to recall anything Grandpa might have said about the painting. I remembered him telling me once that Grandma had found it at an estate sale in Portland back in '83. The elderly owner had died, and his children were selling off his belongings for quick cash. They'd priced the paintings by frame size, $5 for small ones, $10 for the medium, $20 for the large. Your grandmother had an eye, Grandpa had said with that smile that always made his eyes crinkle. She said this one called to her. Best $5 we ever spent. He'd always kept it because it reminded him of her, not because he knew its secret. And now, by some twist of fate or cosmic joke, that painting had ended up with me, the family disappointment, who happened to be curious enough to look behind the backing. I couldn't help but wonder about the painting's previous owner. Who was the elderly man who died? How did he come to possess what might be an original Declaration of Independence? Did he know what he had? Did his children unknowingly sell off a fortune for $5? There were so many questions, and I doubted I'd ever get answers to most of them. But one thing was clear. I needed to find out if this document was the real deal. Dawn broke with me still awake, my mind racing with possibilities. The document needed expert authentication. I couldn't just walk into a museum with what might be a priceless historical artifact and expect to be taken seriously, especially looking like I did after days without proper sleep, wearing the same oil-stained jeans I'd had on since the funeral. I needed a plan. I needed to find someone with credentials who wouldn't immediately dismiss me as a crackpot. I pulled up the website for the State Historical Society and found their document authentication page. By some miracle, they had open appointment slots for their monthly authentication clinic the very next day. I booked one immediately, listing historical document, possible 18th century, in the description field. Then I showered, shaved, and found the cleanest button-up shirt I owned. If I was going to present a potential national treasure, I at least needed to look moderately respectable. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to check on the manila envelope, half convinced it would somehow disappear or spontaneously combust while I wasn't looking. I even took a photo of where I'd hidden it in my sock drawer, as if documenting its location would somehow protect it. The whole situation felt surreal. Yesterday, I was just a guy with a crappy job and a collection of his dead grandfather's paintings. Today, I might be the accidental owner of a piece of American history worth more than I'd earn in 10 lifetimes. The Historical Society was housed in an imposing brick building downtown, the kind with Greek columns and stone steps that made you feel small and underdressed no matter what you were wearing. I arrived 20 minutes early, the manila envelope protected inside a plastic container I'd bought at Target that morning. The receptionist directed me to Authentication Room B, where a gray-haired woman with glasses on a chain around her neck greeted me with professional politeness. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Winters, head of document authentication," she said, not offering to shake hands. "What have you brought us today, Mr. Wilson?" I tried to sound casual, like this was totally normal. "I found a document hidden in the back of a painting. I think it might be historically significant." Dr. Winters raised an eyebrow, probably having heard similar claims from countless hopeful treasure hunters. "Well, let's have a look." With hands that betrayed my nervousness, I opened the plastic container and carefully slid out the manila envelope. Then, as gently as possible, I extracted the folded paper and laid it on the examination table. Dr. Winters put on a pair of white cotton gloves before touching it. She unfolded it with practiced precision, her expression professionally neutral, until she read the first line. Her eyes widened slightly, the academic equivalent of a gasp. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Her tone completely changed. "It was hidden behind a painting my grandfather owned, a painting my grandmother bought at a garage sale in the 80s. I just found it while cleaning the frame." I swallowed hard. "Is it what I think it is?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for her phone on the wall and pressed a single button. "Stephen, I need you in Authentication B. Immediately." She hung up without waiting for a response. Then she turned back to me. "Mr. Wilson, I'm going to need to bring in our lead expert on 18th century documents." A balding man in his 60s appeared within minutes, slightly out of breath as if he'd run down the hallway. Dr. Winters gestured to the document without speaking. The man put on gloves, leaned over the paper, and went completely still. After what felt like eternity, he pulled a jeweler's loupe from his pocket and examined the document inch by inch, occasionally murmuring to himself. Finally, he looked up at me. "Young man, where exactly did this come from?" I explained about the painting, the garage sale, how I discovered it. With each word, the two experts exchanged increasingly meaningful glances. "We'll need to run some tests," Dr. Winters said. "Spectral analysis, paper dating, ink authentication. This will take time." "What do you think it is?" I asked, though I already knew. Stephen, who hadn't introduced himself yet, removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "If, and I stress if this is authentic, it appears to be a Dunlap broadside. An original first printing of the Declaration of Independence from July 4th, 1776. Dr. Winters nodded. "There are fewer than 30 known to exist. Most are in museums or major institutional collections. How much is it worth?" The question slipped out before I could stop myself. Stephen gave me a look that was part disbelief, part amusement. If authentic, the last one sold at auction went for $8.14 million. The room swayed a little. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "We'll need to keep this here for testing," Dr. Winters said. "We'll provide a receipt, of course. The process typically takes 2 weeks, but given the nature of this item, we might expedite it." I nodded, unable to form words. They had me sign some forms, gave me a receipt, and escorted me to the door with promises to call the moment they had preliminary results. I stood on those imposing stone steps, staring blankly at passing traffic. My grandfather had unknowingly kept what might be an $8 million historical document behind a $5 garage sale painting for decades, and now it was my responsibility. The next week was the longest of my life. I went back to work to avoid arousing more suspicion from my boss, but I couldn't focus on anything. I nearly put diesel in a Honda Accord and had to be corrected by a 16-year-old apprentice. Every time my phone rang, I nearly jumped out of my skin. What if the Historical Society called with bad news? What if it was a fake? What if it was real, but somehow I wasn't a legal owner? What if someone broke into my apartment and stole all the other paintings, thinking each one might contain another treasure? I even found myself looking at my neighbors differently. Did Mrs. Rodriguez from 3B know? Was that why she was suddenly bringing me homemade tamales? Because you look too skinny? Was a new guy in 2 actually a sophisticated art thief? I was turning into a paranoid mess. Grandpa would have laughed so hard at my behavior. "Fear makes fools of the wise and wise men of fools," he used to say. I was definitely in the fool category at the moment. 8 days after leaving the document with the Historical Society, my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered it so quickly, I nearly dropped the phone. Mr. Wilson, this is Dr. Winters from the State Historical Society. We have some preliminary results we'd like to discuss. Could you come in tomorrow morning? Her tone gave nothing away. I agreed to be there at 9 a.m. sharp, then spent the entire night staring at my ceiling, imagining every possible outcome. When I arrived at the Historical Society the next morning, I was escorted not to the authentication room, but to a conference room on the top floor. Inside waited Dr. Winters, Stephen, whose last name I learned was Hargrove, the Society's senior authenticator, and a woman in a suit who introduced herself as Diana Chun, the Society's legal counsel. My stomach dropped. Why did they need a lawyer? Please, sit down, Mr. Wilson, Dr. Winters said, gesturing to a chair. We have quite a bit to discuss. I lowered myself into the seat, trying to read their expressions. All three maintained that professional neutrality that could mask either very good or very bad news. First, Dr. Winters began, we've completed our preliminary authentication process. She paused, and in that moment, I understood what people mean when they say their heart skipped a beat. The document is, beyond reasonable doubt, an authentic Dunlap broadside, one of the original first printings of the Declaration of Independence from July 4th, 1776. The room started spinning again. Furthermore, she continued, based on certain unique characteristics in the printing and paper, we believe this may be one of the copies sent to Colony's Continental Army officers, specifically to a Colonel Jonathan Trumbull. I gripped the arms of my chair. This wasn't just a Dunlap broadside. It was one with a specific historical provenance. Mr. Wilson, Stephen Hargrove said, leaning forward, what you've discovered isn't just valuable in monetary terms. It's an extraordinary piece of American history. The lawyer, Diana Chun, cleared her throat, which brings us to what happens next. What happened next would change everything, but not in the way I expected. The conference room at the Historical Society felt like a courtroom. Diana Chun, the legal counsel, slid a folder across the table toward me. Before we proceed, Mr. Wilson, we need to discuss the legal implications of your find, she said. My stomach tightened. Here it comes, I thought. They're going to tell me I don't actually own it, that it belongs to the government or some collector who reported it missing in 1862. As you may know, she continued, historical artifacts of this significance often come with complicated ownership questions, especially when the item has unclear provenance, meaning we don't know its full chain of custody through history. I nodded, trying to look like someone who definitely knew what provenance meant before 30 seconds ago. However, Dr. Winters interjected, in this case, we found no record of this particular Dunlap broadside ever being reported stolen or missing from any collection. And since it was purchased legitimately, albeit unknowingly, by your grandmother decades ago, we have no reason to believe you don't have legal ownership. I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That said, Stephen Hargrove added, you should be aware that with an item of this historical significance, there are considerations beyond mere ownership. The three of them explained that while I technically own the document, its historical importance made it more than just personal property. They recommended having it professionally preserved and considering either loaning it to a major museum or selling it through a reputable auction house that specialized in historical documents. Christie's and Sotheby's would both be very interested, Dr. Winters said. They have the expertise to handle something of this magnitude. My head was spinning. Yesterday, I was worrying about making rent. Today, I was being advised on which world-famous auction house should handle my multi-million-dollar historical document. The next month passed in a blur. I hired an attorney specializing in rare artifacts and historical items, something I didn't even know existed as a specialty until I needed one. She advised me on every step of the process, explaining the complex legalities of selling historical artifacts and helping me understand my options. Christie's won the bidding war to auction my Dunlap broadside. Their experts confirmed everything the Historical Society had found and added more details. The specific copy had been sent to Colonel Jonathan Trumbull of the Continental Army in July 1776. They traced its path through several generations of his family until the mid-1800s, when it disappeared from historical record. presumably tucked behind that landscape painting sometime before my grandmother unknowingly bought it at a garage sale in 1983. The auction was scheduled for 3 months out to allow time for international marketing to serious collectors and institutions. I didn't tell my family immediately, not because I wanted to keep it from them, but because I needed time to process everything myself before dealing with their reactions. I knew my dad would find some way to make me feel undeserving of this windfall, and Kate would have opinions about what I should do with the money. But secrets have a way of getting out, especially multi-million-dollar secrets that make the local news. The day after Christie's issued their press release announcing the upcoming auction of a newly discovered Dunlap broadside with exceptional provenance, my phone exploded with notifications. First came texts from old high school friends I hadn't heard from in years. Then distant relatives I barely remembered. And finally, the call I'd been dreading. "Jack, it's Dad. We need to talk." His voice was controlled, but I could hear the tension underneath. I agreed to meet them for dinner that weekend, buy myself a few more days of peace. When I arrived at my parents' house, Kate's car was already in the driveway. Of course they'd called in reinforcements. I sat in my car for a few minutes, gathering my courage, remembering Grandpa's words. The hardest conversations are usually the most important ones. The dinner started with strained pleasantries and obvious attempts to avoid the elephant in the room. Mom kept refilling water glasses that were still full. Dad repeatedly adjusted the thermostat. Kate checked her phone every 30 seconds. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "So, $9 million. And just like that, we were in it. Potentially, I corrected. That's just the estimate. It could go for less. Or more, Kate added, her voice tight. Dad leaned forward. "Jack, this is a family matter. That painting belonged to all of us. It was in your grandfather's house, which was part of his estate, which belongs to the family." I felt heat rising in my neck. "The painting you were throwing in a dumpster? The one you called worthless junk?" "We didn't know what was in it," Kate said. "Neither did I. Neither did Grandpa or Grandma. That's the point. None of us knew." Mom reached across the table and touched my hand. "Honey, we're not saying you shouldn't benefit from this. It's a family discovery. It should help the whole family." I looked at their faces, expectant, entitled, already counting their shares. The same people who had dismissed Grandpa's art as garbage, who had rolled their eyes at my similar interests for years, who had never seen value in anything that couldn't be easily quantified. "I saved those paintings when you were going to trash them," I said quietly. I was the only one who cared about Grandpa's legacy. I was the one who actually looked at that old painting closely enough to find what was hidden inside. Dad's jaw tightened. "So that gives you the right to keep everything?" $9 million. The argument escalated quickly. Dad insisted I had a moral obligation to share the proceeds with the family. Kate suggested I was being manipulated by Christie's and my new advisors. Mom tried to keep the peace, but clearly sided with them. "You stole that painting from the house," Dad finally said, his voice rising. "Technically, that's theft from the estate." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I didn't steal anything. You were throwing them away. You literally told me to take whatever I wanted because the rest goes tomorrow." Those were your exact words. "We're talking about $9 million. Jack, not some worthless paintings." And there it was. The paintings themselves, Grandpa's life's work, still meant nothing to them. Only the money mattered. I left feeling angry and hurt, but also strangely empowered. For the first time in my life, I was in a position where my family couldn't make me feel small. I had options they couldn't imagine. I had advisors of my own. I had leverage. My attorney assured me that legally, I was on solid ground. The painting had been abandoned property that I salvaged. Even if that weren't the case, the statute of limitations for claiming abandoned property was much shorter than the decade since Grandma had purchased it. But legal and ethical are different considerations, she reminded me. You need to decide what feels right to you, regardless of what the law allows. I spent a lot of time thinking about what Grandpa would have done, about his values, his quiet dignity, his generosity of spirit. The auction date approached with dizzying speed. Christie's had created a beautiful catalog featuring the Dunlap broadside, with an entire section dedicated to its rediscovery, hidden behind a modest landscape painting in a Pacific Northwest garage sale purchase. They even included a photo of the painting itself, which made me smile. That unremarkable landscape was now getting its own moment in the spotlight. I flew to New York a week before the auction. Christie's had arranged for me to stay in a hotel that cost more per night than my monthly rent back home. They treated me like royalty, a far cry from the greased monkey who couldn't get a call back from the local art school. The night before the auction, I couldn't sleep. I stood at the window of my hotel room, looking out at the glittering city, thinking about how much had changed in just a few months. I thought about Grandpa in his paint-splattered sweater, sipping tea with raspberry jam, telling me that true value isn't always obvious to everyone. I thought about my family and their anger, their sense of entitlement to something they had been willing to throw away. And I thought about what I really wanted, not just with the money, but with my life. The auction itself was surreal. I sat in a special section reserved for consignor, a fancy word for seller that I'd learned recently. Well-dressed people with serious expressions filled the room. The auctioneer, with his British accent and impeccable timing, made the whole thing feel like theater. When my lot came up, the room hushed. The opening bid was $4 million. What happened next was like watching a tennis match where the ball was made of money. Bidders raised paddles, made subtle nods, whispered into phones. The price climbed. $5 million, $6 million, $7 million. At $8.5 million, it slowed to just two bidders, a representative for a private collector and someone from a major institution. They battled in $100,000 increments, each bid making my heart thud harder. $10.7 million, said the institutional bidder. A pause. The private collector's representative shook his head. $10.7 million, dollar going once, going twice. The auctioneer's gavel fell. Sold to the National Archives Trust. The room erupted in applause. I sat frozen in my seat. $10.7 million for a document that had been hiding behind a $5 painting in my grandfather's house for decades. After auction fees and taxes, I would clear about $8.2 million. More money than I could have earned in multiple lifetimes at the auto shop. The reality of it didn't sink in until the check cleared my newly established account a week later. I stared at the balance on my phone screen, the number so large it seemed fake, like Monopoly money. My attorney had connected me with a financial advisor who specialized in sudden wealth clients. She helped me create a sensible investment plan, a trust to protect the principal, a modest annual draw that would let me live comfortably without working, if that's what I wanted. So, she asked during our post-auction meeting, what's the first thing you want to do with your new resources? I knew exactly what I wanted. 3 months later, I stood in front of a converted warehouse in the arts district of my hometown. The sign above the door read, Frank's Legacy Gallery, in simple, elegant letters. Below it, in smaller text, celebrating art that speaks to the soul. Inside, the space had been transformed. Grandpa's paintings, all 55 of them, hung in perfect lighting, each with a small plaque describing when and why he had created it. The infamous landscape that had hidden the Dunlap broadside had its own special display, alongside photos of the document and the story of its discovery. But the gallery wasn't just about Grandpa's work. The back half of the space featured rotating exhibits from local artists who, like him, created art without formal training or recognition. There was a small studio where children could take free art classes on weekends. And in the corner, a cozy seating area with art books and a tea station that always included raspberry jam. I had bought a modest house nearby, nothing extravagant, just comfortable, with a room converted into a studio where I had finally started using those professional brushes Grandpa had given me. I drove a new but practical car. I dressed the same, ate at the same diners, kept most of the same habits. The money hadn't changed me as much as the confidence that came with it. The freedom to make choices based on what I value rather than what I could afford. My family's reaction to the gallery opening invitation was mixed. Mom called immediately to say they'd be there. Dad didn't respond at first. Kate sent a text saying she was glad I was doing something worthwhile with the money, a backhanded compliment that still stung. On opening night, the gallery was packed. Local artists, neighborhood folks. Even my old boss in the auto shop showed up, awkwardly holding a glass of champagne and admiring Grandpa's landscapes with genuine interest. I spotted my mother near the entrance, dabbing at her eyes as she looked at the earliest paintings from when Grandpa was first retired. Dad stood beside her, his expression unreadable. Kate was by the refreshment table, looking surprisingly impressed. I had been avoiding them, making rounds to other guests first, but I knew I needed to face them eventually. As I approached, Dad turned to me, his face solemn. "This is not what I expected." He said, "Finally, it's better." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a full endorsement. But for my father, it was something close to acceptance. I saw him looking around the space, perhaps seeing for the first time what both Grandpa and I had been trying to show him for years, that art had value beyond price tags, that legacy meant more than money. Mom hugged me tightly, whispering how proud Grandpa would have been. Kate, in her way, offered a truce by asking intelligent questions about some of the paintings. As the night wore on, my lawyer approached with a small package. "The paperwork you requested," she said with a smile. "All executed and ready." I thanked her and tucked it away for later. That part of my plan could wait until the right moment. The gallery became my main focus. I hired a professional curator to handle the day-to-day operations, but I was there most days anyway, learning about art in a way I never could have afforded before. I started taking classes at the local college, not for a degree, just for the knowledge. Word spread about the space, especially the story behind it. The local paper did a feature, then a regional magazine, then a small segment on a national morning show. People came to see the $8 million painting frame and stayed for Grandpa's art and the other exhibits. I started a grant program for working-class artists who, like Grandpa, created in the margins of their busy lives. I called it the Second Act Fund in honor of how he had flourished after retirement. Throughout it all, my family kept a careful distance. They came to major events at the gallery, but rarely just to visit. The money issue hung between us like a fog that never quite cleared. 6 months after the opening, on what would have been Grandpa's 80th birthday, I invited them to a private dinner at the gallery. They came, still slightly awkward but civil. After dessert, I handed each of them an envelope. "What's this?" Dad asked, suspicion edging his voice. "Open it," I said. Inside each envelope was a legal document establishing a trust fund in their names. Not the full amount they thought they deserved, but substantial, enough to pay off mortgages, fund retirement accounts, cover Kate's kids' college tuition. "I don't understand," Mom said, her hands trembling slightly as she held the papers. "Why now?" I looked around the gallery, at Grandpa's paintings watching over us like silent witnesses. "Because Grandpa taught me that true value isn't in what you keep," I said. "It's in what you share." I paused, finding the right words. "I didn't owe you this legally, maybe not even morally, but I wanted to do it, not because you're entitled to it, but because I choose to share it." Dad was staring at the document, uncharacteristically quiet. Kate looked torn between gratitude and lingering resentment that it had been my decision to make. "There's one condition," I added. They all looked up. "I want us to be a family again. Not perfect, not without disagreements, but without this hanging between us." Dad cleared his throat, eyes suspiciously damp. "Your grandfather will be proud," he said finally, "of the gallery, of what you've done with it, of who you've become." It wasn't quite an apology for throwing away the paintings, for dismissing both my and Grandpa's passion for years. But it was something, a beginning. As they left that night, something had shifted. The money that had threatened to divide us permanently had instead opened a door to a different kind of relationship, one based on choice rather than obligation. I thought I had found a fortune when I discovered that document behind the painting. But the real treasure wasn't the money at all. It was discovering who I could be when given the chance to define my own worth. The gallery flourished. I eventually expanded to a second location in Portland. The money made it possible, but it was Grandpa's spirit that made it meaningful. Every day, visitors would leave notes saying how the space had inspired them, how it had reminded them of their own creative dreams. I kept the truth to myself, that the greatest art Grandpa ever created wasn't hanging on those walls. It was the example he set for me, the way he showed me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. That value isn't determined by others' opinions, that the most precious things often hide in plain sight, waiting for someone to truly see them. And sometimes when I was alone in the gallery late at night, I could almost hear him laughing at the cosmic joke of it all, how a worthless painting had changed everything, not because of what was hidden inside it, but because it had been worth saving in the first place.